Blood and Curse: The Truth Behind Salem. Forensic investigators found, beneath a parking lot in Salem, Massachusetts, the confirmed execution site of 19 people. And DNA analysis is now helping researchers understand what actually drove one of the most catastrophic episodes of mass injustice in the history of the English-speaking world. The year is 1692. The place is Salem Village, Massachusetts, a settlement carved out of forest on the northeastern edge of a continent that European settlers had occupied for barely 3 generations. Life for the Puritan community here was organized around a single absolute belief: that God governed every aspect of existence, that the devil was equally real and equally present, and that human beings were caught between those two forces at every waking moment. This was not metaphor. Colonial Massachusetts law treated witchcraft as a capital crime. The invisible world, spirits, demons, divine intervention, was treated as legally factual. Church attendance was mandatory. Community surveillance of individual behavior was constant and expected. The village was geographically isolated. The forest surrounding it was understood as dangerous both physically and spiritually. Relations with indigenous nations had been violent within living memory, leaving settler communities across New England with a pervasive sense of external threat. Into this setting, in January 1692, came the first symptoms. Betty Parris, the 9-year-old daughter of the village minister, and her cousin Abigail Williams began exhibiting alarming behavior: convulsions, unusual physical contortions, reports of being pinched and bitten by forces no one else could see. A physician examined both and found no physical cause. His recorded conclusion was that they were suffering from an evil hand. The question that followed, whose hand, would tear the community apart. Historical records found in colonial court archives identify Tituba, an enslaved woman in the Parris household, as one of the first 3 people accused of witchcraft in Salem, and as the individual whose extraordinary courtroom confession transformed a local crisis into a colony-wide emergency. Tituba's precise origins remain one of the genuinely unresolved questions of Salem history. Contemporary records confirm she came from Barbados and arrived in Massachusetts as part of Samuel Parris's household when he relocated there. Some historians identify her as of Arawak indigenous Caribbean ancestry. Others suggest mixed African and indigenous heritage. No contemporary document specifies her background with precision. What is documented in detail is the role she played. Before the formal accusations began, a neighbor named Mary Sibley instructed Tituba and her husband John Indian to prepare a witch cake, a piece of English folk magic involving rye meal mixed with the urine of the afflicted girls, baked and fed to a dog. The practice was believed to identify a witch by producing a physical reaction in the animal. Parris discovered what had happened and was furious. The witch cake incident is recorded in his own accounts. Shortly afterward, Betty and Abigail began naming the people they said were tormenting them. Tituba was among the first 3 named. Her response to interrogation was the pivot point of the entire Salem story. Rather than denying the charge, as the other 2 initial accused, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, did, Tituba confessed in elaborate detail. She described a tall man from Boston who came to her with a book, demanding she sign it. She described animal familiars. She described a network of witches operating within the community. Her confession was believed, recorded in full, and used to justify expanding the search for accomplices across the entire village and beyond. Court transcripts found in the Massachusetts State Archives show, with uncomfortable clarity, the specific mechanisms by which the Salem accusations spread, and the legal framework that made accusation almost impossible to defend against. The initial targets, Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne, shared a common profile. They were marginal figures. Good was effectively homeless, surviving by begging from neighbours who openly resented her presence. Osborne was elderly, had not attended church regularly for years, and had a contested marital history. Tituba was enslaved. None of them had the social standing to mount a credible defence. As the accusations expanded, the pattern followed the existing fault lines of the community. Salem Village was divided between a western agricultural section and an eastern section with closer economic ties to the commercial town of Salem. Historians analysing the accusation records have found that accusers came disproportionately from western farming families, while the accused came disproportionately from the eastern side, or had family connections to it, or had been in land disputes with the accusers' families. The legal structure made resistance catastrophically dangerous. The Court of Oyer and Terminer, established by the colonial governor to handle the mounting cases, accepted spectral evidence. Testimony about dreams and visions in which the accused appeared as a threatening figure. Since no alibi covered what a person's spectral form might do in someone else's dream, the accused had no mechanism of defense. The procedural trap was complete. Denying the accusation put you in direct conflict with the court's established evidentiary framework. Confessing, even falsely, typically led to a lighter outcome, because the court interpreted cooperation as repentance. The logic of the system meant that the only rational choice was to lie, and many people did. Essex County court records document the case of Rebecca Nurse in enough detail to reconstruct it almost day by day. And what that reconstruction reveals is a systematic failure of every protection the community claimed to offer its most respected members. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old when the accusation came in late February 1692. She was a church member in good standing, known for her piety and community service. She had a large family and a solid reputation. When the accusation was announced, the reaction among many who knew her was immediate disbelief. A support petition gathered more than 30 signatures, which was a significant act of public commitment in a community already gripped by fear of being accused themselves. The land dispute connection is specific and documented. The Nurse family's property bordered land claimed by the Putnam family, whose members were among the most active accusers in the entire Salem crisis. Anne Putnam Sr., the mother of one of the primary afflicted girls, was among those who testified against Nurse. The boundary conflict between the families had been a source of tension for years before 1692. At trial, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. The accusers in the courtroom responded with immediate and visible distress, exhibiting the convulsive symptoms that had characterized the entire crisis. The presiding judge directed the jury to reconsider, pointing to a remark Nurse had made during testimony. The jury returned a second time with a guilty verdict. The family recovered her body after the execution and buried her on the family property in an unmarked location, deliberately concealed to prevent further desecration. The Nurse homestead still stands in what is now Danvers, Massachusetts. Rebecca Nurse was formally exonerated by the Massachusetts legislature in 1711, 19 years after her death. Primary sources found in the Salem court records and contemporary diaries document the case of Giles Corey with a specificity that has made him one of the most remembered figures of the crisis. Not because he was executed in the conventional sense, but because of the method used against him and his response to it. Corey was an elderly farmer, over 80 years old, accused in the spring of 1692. His wife Martha was also accused and would later be executed. Corey himself refused to enter a plea in court. Under English common law, a defendant who refused to plead could be subjected to a process called peine forte et dure, the application of heavy stones to the chest, intended to compel a plea. If a defendant died under this process without pleading, their estate could not be legally seized by the court, protecting their family's inheritance. Corey understood this. He stood silent. The pressing continued over 2 days. His recorded final words, repeated each time the court demanded a response, were 2. More weight. He died on September 19, 1692, without entering a plea. His estate passed to his heirs. The conditions in the Salem jail during this period were documented by survivors who later gave testimony. The facility was overcrowded, unheated, and poorly ventilated. Several of the accused died in custody before their cases could be heard. Sarah Good's daughter, Dorcas, who was approximately 4 years old, was imprisoned alongside adult detainees. The child spent months in these conditions and was reported to have suffered lasting psychological effects. The execution site itself, Proctor's Ledge, on the edge of a rocky outcrop above the town, was identified with precision only in 2016 through a combination of historical research, ground-penetrating radar, and soil analysis. A permanent memorial now marks the location. Unlike the practice in parts of continental Europe, which used burning, Salem used hanging. Researchers found, when they examined the agricultural and climate records from Salem in 1691 and 1692, a pattern that led historian Linda Caporael to publish a paper in the journal Science in 1976 proposing a physiological explanation for the initial symptoms that launched the crisis. The hypothesis centered on ergot, a fungus, Claviceps purpurea, that grows on rye and related grains under specific climatic conditions. Ergot produces alkaloids that cause convulsions, burning sensations in the extremities, hallucinations, and a range of neurological symptoms that would have been entirely inexplicable to 17th century observers. The connection to LSD is direct. Lysergic acid diethylamide was first synthesized from ergot alkaloids, and the two compounds act on overlapping neurological pathways. Climate records reconstructed from tree ring data and contemporary accounts suggest that the Salem area experienced a cold winter followed by a wet spring in 1691 to 1692, conditions favorable to ergot growth on rye, which was a staple crop of the region. The symptoms recorded for the afflicted girls, convulsions, sensations of being pinched or burned, visual disturbances, are consistent with ergotism. Caporael's paper generated substantial academic discussion and has been debated, challenged, and refined over the 5 decades since publication. The principal objection is that ergotism typically affects all members of a household who share the same food supply, while the pattern in Salem was more selective. Specific individuals were affected, others were not. The symptom pattern also spread through social contact and testimony in ways that ergot contamination cannot explain. The scientific consensus is that ergot may have contributed to the initial physiological trigger in certain individuals, but cannot account for the full social and legal catastrophe that followed. The fungus might have lit the spark. Everything else was human. Forensic genealogists found, when they applied modern DNA analysis to the Salem case, that the question of who was present in 1692 and what biological conditions may have contributed to the crisis could be approached with a precision that documentary history alone had never achieved. The DNA work has proceeded along 2 distinct paths. The first is forensic genealogy, using DNA matching and genealogical databases to trace the living descendants of the Salem participants. This research has established that tens of millions of people, primarily in the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia, carry DNA traceable to families on both sides of the 1692 accusations. The second path is more specific. Researchers examining Tituba's precise ancestry, never resolved by historical records, have used mitochondrial DNA analysis of related Caribbean and indigenous American population samples to assess the probability of different ancestral origins. The work is ongoing and has not produced a definitive identification, but it represents a new tool for resolving questions that written records cannot answer. A more contested line of research has examined whether some of the behavioral symptoms displayed by the afflicted individuals might be consistent with Huntington's disease, a hereditary neurological condition caused by a single gene mutation that produces involuntary movements, psychiatric symptoms, and cognitive changes. The mutation is detectable in ancient DNA. Researchers have proposed that Huntington's presence in certain Salem families could have produced visible neurological symptoms that the community, with no medical framework to explain them, interpreted as supernatural attack. The research remains preliminary, but the question it raises is deeply uncomfortable. Were the people accused of causing those symptoms being blamed for a genetic condition they could not control? Primary sources found in the diaries, church records, and household accounts of 17th-century Massachusetts document a daily life that helps explain how the psychological conditions for collective crisis were built into the ordinary rhythms of Puritan community existence. Dancing was prohibited under Massachusetts law. Christmas had been banned since the 1650s as an unauthorized Catholic invention. Music in church was restricted to unaccompanied psalm singing. Personal adornment was treated as evidence of spiritual vanity. Children were expected to sit through hours of Sunday sermon without visible restlessness. Church membership required a public narration of a personal conversion experience, subject to community judgment. Salem Village was divided along economic lines. Salem Town, the commercial port, had a merchant class with access to trade goods and relative comfort. Salem Village, where the crisis began, was composed of farming families living closer to subsistence, more exposed to crop failure and conflict with neighbors. Social surveillance was total. Relationships between neighbors were entangled with economic dependencies, shared grazing land, shared labor, shared water access, that made conflict both constant and difficult to escape. Being accused of witchcraft by someone you owed money to, or whose fence line overlapped yours, or whose cattle grazed on your land, was not coincidental. It was the shape of the community's existing tensions, revealing themselves under the pressure of collective fear. The minister's household, where Betty Paris and Abigail Williams lived, was the most scrutinized in the community. Whatever combination of pressures produced their initial symptoms, the environment was uniquely prepared to interpret them as a spiritual emergency. Legal records found in the Massachusetts Colonial Archives document, with surprising precision, the sequence of events that dismantled the Salem court system, and the specific individuals whose actions broke the momentum of a process that had already resulted in 20 deaths and the imprisonment of more than 100 people. The political turning point came when the scope of the accusations reached Governor William Phipps's own household. His wife, Lady Mary Phipps, was named as a suspect. Phipps had established the court of Oyer and Terminer himself in response to the crisis. When its logic turned toward his own family, he recognized that the mechanism he had created could not be controlled. He dissolved the court in October 1692. The intellectual turning point came from Increase Mather, the most prominent Puritan minister in Massachusetts. Mather published a treatise arguing that spectral evidence was theologically insufficient for a capital conviction, that the devil could assume an innocent person's form, and that a nightmare appearance, therefore, could not constitute legal proof of guilt. Coming from Mather, the argument carried decisive authority. A new court was established with stricter evidentiary standards. The remaining imprisoned accused were acquitted or released. Those who had confessed recanted. The colony attempted to return to ordinary legal procedure. In January 1697, Judge Samuel Sewell made a public confession in his church, standing in silence while a statement was read acknowledging his personal responsibility for the injustice of the trials. It remains one of the very few formal admissions of individual guilt in the Salem record. Formal exoneration of the accused proceeded in stages. The legislature passed compensation legislation in 1711, and the last names were cleared from the legal record only in 2001. Researchers found, when they applied forensic and genetic tools to the 300-year-old Salem record, that the case had not fully closed, that the science of identity could still speak to historical injustice, and that the answers it offered changed how the story was understood. The confirmation of the execution site at Proctor's Ledge came only in 2016. For over a century, the precise location had been uncertain. The 2016 identification, achieved through historical document analysis, ground-penetrating radar, and soil composition testing, allowed a permanent memorial to be installed at the exact site. The names of the 19 people executed there are now inscribed at the ground where they stood. DNA genealogy has produced numbers that give the Salem story its contemporary scale. Forensic genealogists estimate that between 10 and 20 million living Americans can trace documented ancestry to one or more Salem families. The accused and the accusers alike are embedded in the family trees of an enormous proportion of the modern population. The crisis of 1692 is not ancient and distant history. Genetically speaking, it is recent. The legal principle the Salem trials helped establish, the presumption of innocence, the inadmissibility of evidence that cannot be objectively tested, is now understood partly as a response to what happens when those protections are suspended. The trials are taught in law schools as an illustration of what courts become when fear replaces evidence. The DNA research into possible biological contributors, ergot, Huntington's, other genetic factors, continues without a definitive conclusion. But applying rigorous modern inquiry to what happened in Salem is itself meaningful. The people who died there deserve the best account the evidence can produce.